Hi, I'm Dr. Donna Wickham, President of ASERI Partners. You may know me from Keystone Assessment, and we recently changed our name to ASERI Partners to reflect the additional work we do beyond just assessment. In fact, our name, ASERI Partners, represents all the additional services we do provide. So we are ASERI, Assessment, Curriculum, Evaluation, Research, and Instruction. I'm here today to introduce the newest mini workshop that we're providing entitled A Self-Evaluation for Improving Inclusion. Mike Burge of ASERI is providing this mini workshop. We at ASERI created the self-evaluation tool because we know in the day-to-day it's sometimes hard to stay focused on that bigger goal of continuing to improve inclusion. We hope that you find the structure of the tool useful, and if you have any comments or suggestions on how to continue to improve the tool, please let us know. As always, feel free to view this video as often as you like and share it with others who you think will find it useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or any of the ASERI partner staff. Thanks, and enjoy our training.
Hi, I'm Mike Burge at ASERI Partners. I'll be narrating this mini workshop on a self-evaluation tool for improving inclusion, which was collaboratively developed by one of ASERI's consultants, Gene Clayton, who is now at EdCount, and myself. This tool was developed based on current research on inclusion and our experiences as teachers of students with extensive learning needs in inclusive classrooms. This mini workshop will focus on a tool for teachers, teams, and schools to use to first self-evaluate their program and then plan how to improve it. The tool uses a system of rubrics to establish the status of your current program, and it covers a range of indicators which we'll call components. These indicators are all based in effective practices, and they include topics such as the academic content being taught, the appropriateness of the supports that are being provided to students, the instructional strategies and materials being used, where instruction takes place, communication considerations, and the quality of general and special education collaboration. After programs have been evaluated using the tool, we'll talk about developing an action plan so that you can make progressive improvements in programming. As I said earlier, each of the 11 components is evaluated with a rubric. Each rubric has 4 levels, and they show a progression from non-implementation or incorrect implementation of a component up to optimal implementation. The rubrics for each component are pretty detailed, so you might want to pause the video on each slide to give yourself time to read all of the levels. We suggest that as you use the tool, it would be a good idea not only to rate the program on each component, but also to provide some evidence of that particular component and why it was rated the way it was. That evidence could be student work, a staff note, meeting minutes, lesson plan specifics, or an anecdotal report. Having some evidence gives a more objective way of documenting a rating, and it might even give you some concrete goals to work for. Of course, it's not enough to know where you are, but you need to know where you want to go and how to get there. So another important step when you use this tool is to develop an action plan. That action plan is probably going to first require you to prioritize some components, while you also consider some of the barriers that affect moving toward your goals. Then you can develop a challenging but practical plan for progress. Before we talk about each component, let's look at how the tool is actually organized. Looking at the rubric format on this slide, you can see that the progression goes from right to left, with cell number 1 on the right being the lowest rating, showing non-implementation or incorrect implementation of the component, and then moving progressively to the left through cells 2 and 3, and ending on the far left with cell number 4 having the highest rating, showing optimal implementation of the component. The tool can be used to evaluate a program in general or specific aspects of a program, like specific academic content areas. This might be really important because anecdotally, We hear that the emphasis on test scores has caused students with disabilities to be removed from inclusive settings. But the research is clear that this is not an effective way to increase scores. In fact, it's just the opposite. All students, both with and without disabilities, achievement levels increase when they are in inclusive environments. Now that you see how the tool is constructed, let's look at this first component specifically. The first component addresses the skills and IEP goals that are targeted for instruction. It's important to make sure that all students in the class are being taught the grade level curriculum and that the instruction is focused on the goal of progress in the general curriculum. We've seen programs that are called inclusive, but students with disabilities are only physically in the class, and the skills and IEP goals they are working on are completely outside of the general curriculum. Evidence of this component could include IEP goals and individual lesson or unit goals and objectives. Component 2 looks at functional skills. Many students need instruction on what are traditionally thought of as functional skills, such as self-care, behavior, and community-based skills. However, the more these skills are taught within the context of the academic school day, the better. Shoe tying can be taught when a student changes clothes for gym class. Money skills can be taught when paying for lunch or buying tickets for a school dance. In fact, whether or not a skill can be instructed during the course of a typical school day might be a really good test of functionality. If I can't find a logical and necessary time during the school day to instruct a skill, then is it really functional for that student? If a student doesn't need to use a skill frequently, how necessary is it really? Now, this isn't to say that there may not be some essential life skills that don't occur on a daily basis during the course of a school day. But it's a really good way to help us think about how to prioritize our instruction when we already don't have enough time. Evidence of this component could be IEP goals, lesson plan directives of when and where instruction on functional skills should be addressed, and anecdotal records. Component 3 addresses what the student is expected to learn. Is the student not just receiving instruction in the general curriculum, but is she expected to learn the general curriculum? We've all seen the example where the student is part of a small group in a class, but is expected to be learning something different from the other students. Let's look at an example from a science class. The student with the IEP is working in a small group with 3 other students on Punnett squares to predict the phenotype of offspring of a pair of yellow-bellied woodpeckers. The other students are expected to learn how to use the Punnett square to make the prediction, but the student with the IEP is expected to learn left, right, top, and bottom. While the context for all students is the general curriculum, the performance expectations for the student with the IEP are very different. They are not linked to the content standards, so this component would be rated as a 1, if only based on this one example. Evidence of this component may be student work, lesson plan objectives, and anecdotal records. Age appropriateness of the instructional materials and activities is the focus of Component 4. Using grade level activities and materials is an important consideration for students who are involved in the grade level curriculum going on in their classroom, but may still be learning some earlier grade level skills. If all students are using The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak to work on the standard of citing strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text, you'd want to see the student with disabilities also using that same book, even though it may need to be significantly modified to make sure it is accessible to him, rather than using a book from a lower grade level. Evidence for this component might include student work and lesson plans. Component 5 examines the supports that are provided to the student in order to make the instruction and content accessible. So there are actually 2 parts to this: the appropriateness of the supports to the student and the relationship of the supports to the general curriculum. For example, if students are working toward a standard of determining perimeter, using a calculator and a formula as supports would not necessarily make the concept of perimeter accessible. It might make the calculation accurate, but not the concept that perimeter is the distance around the outside edges of a two-dimensional shape. So those supports have a weak positive relationship to the curriculum. Now let's look at the relationship of the supports to the student. Still thinking about perimeter, the class activity is using inch cubes to measure the perimeter of a cardstock rectangle. If the student with the IEP has some motor difficulties that don't let her place the cubes without knocking the previously placed cubes out of whack, then that support isn't appropriate for her. Evidence for this component may be student work and materials and activities specified in the lesson plans. Component 6 looks at how many of the instructional materials being used are being made accessible to the student. For instance, if in a typical English language arts classroom, students interact with texts, write in journals, take quizzes on the computer, and work in small groups, supports should be in place to make each one of those activities accessible for the student with disabilities. Evidence here may be notes for accommodation provisions within lesson plans, student work, and anecdotal records. Component 7 focuses on how the program facilitates the students' interactions with age-appropriate activities and materials. Sometimes, just providing age-appropriate materials and activities isn't enough because the student isn't interested in them, or they aren't accessible enough for the student to actually use them. This component acknowledges that this might realistically be the situation, but if it is, does the program actually do anything to facilitate more effective engagement? Evidence for this component might be student work and lesson plan specifics. Component 8 is a quantitative measure, which looks solely at the amount of time a student spends with other students of the same age and grade level. Generally, programs start the journey toward full inclusion by placing the student in classes or activities that are less academic and more activity-based. Because of our experiences, we at ASERI don't advocate that, but we admit that that is what is typically done. Now, the reason we don't advocate for that approach is that many of the less academic, more activity-based classes are less predictable, and they're full of surprises and unexpected events. And those are hard for lots of us, including students with disabilities, to handle. The student's schedule, IEP records, and anecdotal notes might be included as evidence for this component. Component 9 overlaps a little bit with Component 8, but here the focus is not only on time in class, but what goes on in that class and how separate or close the instruction is from the instruction of the typical students. Staff notes, lesson plans, and anecdotal records could be evidence for Component 9. Component 10 examines the existence and use of communication systems. Many students with significant cognitive disabilities do not have effective ways to communicate. In fact, current research shows that a percentage of students enter school without a way to communicate, and after 12 years or more of instruction, that percentage doesn't change. So that same number of students leave school without a way to communicate. As we enter this new world of academic content learning for these students, communication systems also need to be inclusive enough to be used throughout the school day in social and academic situations. IEP records and student work could serve as evidence for this component. Component 11 is really critical because the effectiveness of inclusive programs is dependent upon the collaboration of the general and special education teachers. Each one of these teachers brings essential and specific expertise to the equation. Content area teachers deliver the instruction, but not without the support of the special education teacher. And the special education teacher is dependent upon the content area teacher to ensure that the accommodations for students make the content accessible without changing the academic constructs. Evidence for Component 11 may be lesson plans, IEP records, and meeting minutes. After you have self-evaluated your program, The next step is to develop an action plan that gives you a concrete, step-by-step approach to addressing any areas of need. One common way is to use a structured problem-solving model, like the one on this slide, where you prioritize the components that you want to target for improvement. There are a couple of ways to do this. You might look at what components receive the lowest ratings, or you might decide to work on the ones that can be changed most easily. You can choose to work on as many or as few components as you want, but be realistic. It can be really frustrating to target too many things and not be able to see the improvement that you wanted. After making that decision, you brainstorm ideas and solutions, you choose the most promising, and you establish a plan including steps, a timeline, the persons responsible, and how you might document progress. And this is where the evidence that you've collected to confirm the rating of each component might come in handy. We hope that this self-evaluation tool is useful to you as you develop and refine your inclusive programs. If you have any questions or you think a SARI might be helpful to you in other ways, please contact me, Mike Burge, at mburge@asaripartners.com, or anyone else here at ASARI. Be sure to look at the other free resources on our webpage, asaripartners.com. Thanks very much, and we hope to see you again soon.